Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay. You're listening to New Discourses Bullets, where I give a short bullet point-like summary of a single topic relevant to woke that we all need to understand so we can beat it. And you've heard the phrase, you have heard it, and oh, do you roll your eyes. Real communism has never been tried. There's never been a real communist state. Blah, blah, blah. Well, let's explain this, but the reality is they're not lying. Real communism has never been tried, but the reason is because real communism cannot be tried. It cannot exist. It cannot be attempted. It cannot ever come into being because so-called real communism, the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement and thus a return of man to himself as a social, which is to say human being, as Karl Marx had it, is not possible. It is the heaven of a eschatological religion called communism, and the attempt to implement communism through a path called socialism, which has been tried repeatedly in multiple forms, always ends in catastrophe. It never works. It never will work. Communism is supposed to be the stateless, classless, utopian, global society that comes into being at the end of the long process of socialism, which has to be installed globally as well, finally using its power to transform people back into their socialist nature, because communists believe people are intrinsically socialist and have been alienated from their true being by the existence of private property, thus individuality, thus so-called capitalism or free enterprise, all predicated on the fundamental right for one person to exclude another from his own private property, which is what makes private property private. It's the heaven state when this is supposedly as a global situation. There's no other free enterprise based or other state in existence on the planet. Just socialist states that are transforming people with no comparison, no contamination of the socialist values until they are recreated as they are supposed to be, according to the communist vision. And then and only then will the conditions within the people be right due to their brainwashing and acceptance of their socialist nature for real communism to emerge. So real communism is a utopia. Utopia comes from Greek words that literally mean nowhere, as in it can happen or exist nowhere. There's an old joke, Ronald Reagan used to tell it, that communism only works in two places: hell, where they already have it, and heaven, where they don't need it. And that's speaking actually into the utopian nature, the nowhere nature, the nowhere possible nature of communism. But I want to talk about real communism has never been tried a little bit to demystify this for you, give you an answer to it. The answer is very simple. Real communism has been attempted repeatedly and has ended in absolute catastrophe and misery every single time. And no, you don't have the secret sauce that's going to make it work this time, you arrogant prick. That's the real reply. Real communism has never been tried. Well, guess what? Real communism has been attempted. And the thing that is communism in actuality, or communism in reality, has been tried, and we call it socialism under communist parties that have the vision of using socialism to bring people into communism. That's been tried again and again, and it's always totalitarian, it's always mass murder regimes, it's always a collapse, it's always starvation, it's always a disaster. So real communism has never been tried. What they're saying is that there are various contaminations to the attempt. The socialist process is, Marx's idea was that, all these societies will evolve through time. They'll go from being primitive, and eventually they'll develop slavery, which is the introduction of private property. Thus, all private property is a form of slavery in one way or another. They will then evolve into something that you could call feudalism, where there are, lords and serfs, and the lords basically run everything and own everything. Eventually, the serfs decide they can have a bit of their own. They can each be their own landlord over a small parcel, and things will be better. That stage is called capitalism. And then capitalism, due to its intrinsic contradictions, which is basically, at the end of the day, that it's slavery hiding behind freedom, or as George Orwell put it, freedom is slavery. That's the communist view of capitalism or free enterprise or liberalism, is that freedom is slavery. That these internal contradictions will finally become so great, so much, and in fact so concentrated. When Marx looked back at the feudal era, what he saw was that these conflicts between the classes played out in a variety of different locations all over the place, and so everything was too scattered. But when you get to the capitalist phase, there are the workers who do all the production, and then there are the managers or the bourgeois class who milk off of the production of the laborers or the workers, the proletarian, so that they can enjoy their own lives. So the contradictions boil down into just two sides: the haves versus the have-nots, the proletarian versus the bourgeoisie, however you want to phrase it. The oppressor versus oppressed becomes clear. And those internal contradictions will become so great that there will be a rupture, and people will demand to own what are already socialized means of production. See, in capitalism, what's going to happen is there's going to be all these huge corporations which are actually a gigantic social means of production. You don't have one guy making in a blacksmith shop all of his things and selling them to some farmer who's raising his crops, and everybody's got their own business. No. You have one guy who's employing a ton of other people to do something for him that he can turn around and sell, and he offers those laborers a tiny amount of payment, an insufficient amount of payment for their labor to build his vision and bring it into the world so he can sell it and profit. So it's already a socialized process of production. It's a very weird way for them to think of this. But Marx's idea was, at the end stage, basically capitalism is all just a bunch of crony monopolies. You have fully socialized production. All you got to do is take the bosses out and replace them with collective ownership, and everything will work exactly the same way without the oppressive system, because now everybody's owners. It doesn't work. He called that expropriating the expropriators, as a matter of fact, because these capitalists has expropriated the feudal producers from their feudal production, and now we're going to expropriate them and enter into a state of socialism where everybody shares ownership in common, but because that's unwieldy and people's minds haven't been adapted to this yet, it has to be consecrated in a state. And the dictatorship of the proletariat will be the government that will rule with totalitarian power to manage everybody's affairs. So socialism actually refers to, in practice, state ownership of the means of production, and the state is supposed to represent the idea of the people. The communist belief is that when you do this long enough, people will realize that the socialist method is superior, and in fact that they're ideally and by nature suited to be highly productive socialists who produce for each other all the time. At which point you won't need a government to do it anymore. He said it will wither away of its own accord. The state will wither away. Lenin said the socialist state is not a state because a state maintains class antagonisms. But what the socialist state does is erases class antagonisms over time. So it's only a semi-state. It only does one of the two functions of the state. The state for Lenin and for Marx is something that maintains class antagonisms. And then on the other side, what it does is that it suppresses the people who don't like what's going on. So the Leninist semi-state, the socialist state, only does that second thing. It only suppresses people who don't like socialism. So the purpose of the socialist state is to destroy the enemies of the socialist state, internal and external, and to spread itself like an international cancer until every country has it. Because if a socialist country sees a capitalist country that appears to be doing better, it will get bourgeois ideas of private property ownership in its mind, and it will alienate people from their true socialist nature. So this is the idea, is that over the time and increasing power, Stalin said that the state will begin to wither away of its own accord at the precise instant it reaches its zenith of power, meaning totalitarian power, to remold people's minds to make them believe they're socialists against their actual nature and against reality. And so the idea is eventually the socialist state will get so powerful and will have lasted for so many generations that everybody just believes socialism is what we are. They will remember is actually the theory that that's what we are. And then the stateless, classless utopia of communism will emerge. But to get there, you have to have every country in the world has to be a fully functioning totalitarian socialist semi-state that punishes and crushes everybody who doesn't go along with the program, because communism as a utopian heaven state on earth, the kingdom of God on earth, the re-entrance into Eden on man's own terms and open defiance of God, only can come into being according to the communist belief system when everybody believes it and lives that belief perfectly, which means everybody who's still alive believes it and acts that belief perfectly. So real communism has never been tried because real communism cannot be tried, but the attempt to bring communism into being has been tried repeatedly. The communist model of socialism with the goal of creating a communism on the other side of the socialist experiment has been tried, and it has failed miserably. It is being tried now with a new method of totalitarianism, a softer method of totalitarianism. That's the social credit model. The social credit model, as I've described in the past, is effectively an opt-in model of tyranny. You don't have to participate in the new program. Nobody's going to show up at your door with a gun. Maybe not, unless you do something really that they don't like. They're not necessarily going to put you in prison. They're just going to not let you participate in society while telling you you're more than welcome to participate in society fully whenever you're ready and whenever you enter into the social credit ideological remolding program and play by all of its rules. You don't have to be a citizen. You are free to be a subject of the state with few rights, no opportunities, etc. But man, is it going to be better and easier if you just get on the socialist program. So it's still being attempted. And this social credit program, this soft totalitarianism, this opt-in tyranny, is just, you think of it as a method of social control, and it is, but it's actually a very sophisticated mechanism of dog training for humans. It is operant conditioning, as maybe Pavlov or Maslow would have had it. The idea is that you are going to, it was Maslow the behaviorist, Skinner, not Maslow. So the idea is that you're going to be trained to participate, to remember your socialist nature through this. Now, just as an aside, we've now understood that real communism has never been tried, is a technically true statement that hides a lie, which is that the lie is that real communism could be tried. The truth is real communism can never be tried. The right reply is, when you hear this, is real communism has been attempted a bunch of times and we're never going to get there. It cannot be tried. But here's an interesting little factoid that's worth paying attention to. It turns out the same exact messaging works for other totalitarian systems as well. For example, fascism. Fascism isn't quite as in, vogue, or hasn't been. It's starting to be again, unfortunately, but hasn't been in as much vogue as communism through the last maybe 75 years since, Hitler and Mussolini basically ruined that for everybody, and for the right reasons. It's completely crap. But here in 1997, we had Alexander Dugin, who is a Russian fascist and Russian National Socialist, who's sometimes called Putin's brain. He's a very influential, somehow, he's a Satanist and a weirdo, but somehow he's an influential Russian philosopher that's currently living. He's a darling of this so-called new right or dissident right or woke right or post-liberal right for whatever reason. And he wrote this essay in 1997 called Fascism, Borderless and Red, making an appeal for a new fascist system for Russia, in fact, a national socialist system for Russia. And what he's complaining about is all the fascist systems in history weren't real fascism. And that's why they didn't succeed. Real fascism has never been tried. And you say, really? Is he so stupid as to really said real fascism hasn't been tried? Well, not in exactly those words. Here's the exact sentence. In history, clean ideal fascism did not experience a direct incarnation. And he goes on to explain that what happens is, in practice, in order to get power, the fascist dictators have to make deals with different people, the corporations, the business leaders, the conservatives, the different parties, the religious leaders. They have to make these deals and compromise on this core thing that really characterizes fascism, which is a pathos, a pathological, emotionally driven feeling that characterizes what real fascism is. So the practicalities of installing a fascist state in the 20th century, say with Mussolini and Hitler, both of whom he references, weren't real fascism. He also mentions Franco and Salazar, that's Spain and Portugal, not quite as famous as Hitler and Mussolini in Germany and Italy. And he says, these guys, might have been attempting it, But they weren't doing the thing. He even calls Franco out pretty specifically. He wasn't even a real fascist. He made all these deals. He cut all these, concessions in order to get his power and stabilize his power and have his power. And so he didn't implement the idealistic, and that's the word he actually uses, the idealistic fascism, the utopian vision of fascism, the nowhere possible vision of fascism. So real fascism has never been tried. And guess what, guys? Real fascism can never be tried in that idealistic sense. But what can happen is the attempt by implementing something called a fascist state that is not supposed to wither away like the communist state. It is supposed to consecrate and perfect itself. It is to become the super state over the superhuman, and that's Dugin's language is talking about the superhuman. It is to become the super Leviathan, for those of you who know your Thomas Hobbes, that rules over a new breed of men that the fascist state has brought into being through leadership, discipline, purity, including racial purity, ethnic purity, and obedience. This is the idea, and real fascism has never been tried either. Why? Because real fascism is an ideal, just like real communism is an ideal, and the ideal cannot be realized in the real. The best you can ever hope for in reality is an optimum. You can optimize across a lot of variables, which you end up having to trade off for at some point in order to get more, say, cleanliness. You have to have, and say if you're purifying a contaminated stream, you have to spend more and more and more money, or you might have to damage the living things that are in it, or something like this. There are huge trade-offs eventually. So all we can do in reality is optimize against lots of competing variables, some of which limit our ability to realize anything better. So the good becomes as good as we can get, and we don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. Another expression for that would be, don't let the imaginary or the ideal become the enemy of the real. And these are idealist systems. So real communism can never be tried. Real fascism can never be tried. Communism and fascism can be put into practice, however, in reality, and they are totalitarian death machines. They are catastrophes. They should be avoided at all costs. And so should be the idealism that motivates them, that motivates the people who take them up, and that animates them to say, it'll work this time. I can do it better, because real communism has never been tried.